She counted the bills again as if repeating them could remake the sum. $15 in small, worn notes, a faded 10, and a stubborn 5 tucked under a paper napkin. Outside, snow came down thin and clean, covering footprints already half gone. Inside the diner, a heater clanked and coughed, and the vinyl of the booth was cold against her elbows. The laminated menu, smeared with fingerprints, promised grilled cheese and milk for kids at a price she could almost manage. For a moment she let herself imagine the two little faces across from her, Chloe's chipped tooth when she grinned, Palmer's smudged front that always caught his milk mustache, and the world narrowed to the warm triangle of toast, cheese, melting, milk in a paper cup. Juliana Molina folded her hands around the paper, letting their heat seep through. She had learned to make choices with surgical calm, which bills could wait, which calls to avoid, how to answer a knock that might bring a man in a suit, a paper, and a polite cruelty. She had learned to keep panic small, in the space between breaths, so the twins would not feel it. Tonight, the calculation was simple and brutal. $15, grilled cheese for 2? Milk? Or nothing. Behind the counter, the waitress, young, tired, with a namatag that read Ella, moved with the brisk, machine-like kindness of someone who had seen too many quiet falls. She took Juliana's order without looking at the money first, then set a small saucer of sugar packets on the table and smiled in an attempt that didn't reach her eyes. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and the faint sugar-like hope that always comes with chain restaurant pies. A radio somewhere played a brittle arrangement of a Christmas tune that barely made it past the jangle of forks. Juliana thought of how the house had gone, the tow truck at dawn, the hydraulic groan against their driveway, the men lifting away, the boxers, with the same benign professionalism they would bring to any repossession. She saw David Gunn himself, a figure that shrank in the windshield as the truck pulled out. Debt collectors had started calling after. They had a pleasant, efficient rhythm of menace. Letters with legalese. A man named Gregor Petro, who liked his threats soft and his payments stiff. Tommy Rudo, who wore a face that made small men uncomfortable. They left voicemails like weather reports. Cold, inevitable, impersonal. The bank did not care about her grief. The law did not reach through late-night knocks and whispered threats in parking lots. She had slept in 3 different motels in 3 months. The twins had learned how to make a bed out of blankets and the top sheet so that the fluorescent light didn't wake them. They had learned to be small. Chloe's knees had become maps of scraped playground years. Palmer had started to sing himself to sleep, and that Sonthian bride was the only thing that kept Juliana honest about whether she was holding on for herself or for them. She watched the 2 children breathe, their tiny hands clinging to the edge of the bench. Chloe had a curl that fell into her eyes when she laughed. Palmer mouthed the edges of his thumb and rolled a little side to side, as if searching for balance. Juliana smoothed Chloe's hair and felt the slack in her own jaw. Fear had a physical weight in her shoulders now, a contraction that lived there day and night. When the waitress came back carrying a steaming plate, she set it down with a small ritual. Napkin, fork, paper cup, 2 grilled cheeses, 2 milks, Ella said, on the house. The words hit Juliana like a hand on the shoulder, and immediately a counterweight in her chest, relief and shame braided together. I can't, she began, but Ella shook her head. Don't be silly. Ella's voice was softer now. You look like you need it. Merry Christmas. Juliana's mouth made a hollow sound she did not intend to let the children hear. She wanted to say thank you, to explain, to press the money she had folded into the napkin back into Ella's hand and walk them out. Instead, she watched Chloe and Palmer dig into the cheese with the small, feral delight children get when something good is unexpected. For a fishing second she let herself believe no one knew who she was. No one knew about the envelopes. No one would come knocking to repossess these warm slices of bread. The door side opened about the time Chloe reached for more cheese. Snow clung to the shoulders of the man who stepped into the doorway and then slid down his black overcoat onto the linoleum. The diner hushed the way it had withdraws. Movement slowed. Forks paused in transit. Conversations tightened like threads. It wasn't the coat nor the crispness of his shoes. It was the way he moved, a particular economy of gesture that suggested the room mattered in the scale of himself, that this place was one small instrument in a larger, quieter plan. Adriano Silva. The name had weight in some neighborhoods. It wasn't brandished. It hummed under people's teeth. His face was not a map of scars or swagger. He was an ordinary handsome man if luck had stopped at his feet, with a jawline that suggested strictness and a slight gray at the temple that announced patience. He wore restraint, the kind you see in men who have learned how to make decisions on behalf of other people's lives. His eyes scanned, not crudely, but with the focus of someone reading more than a room, details of purchase, the way hands were held, the temperature of fear. He carried a small leather portfolio, the kind that suggested business rather than a sudden act. Juliana felt the hush before she identified the cause. The diner had 1,000 tiny alarms calibrated to social danger. Hers went off with a hard, nanosecond sting. She kept her face neutral, because she knew what neutrality bought. A chance. Chloe looked up. Fork paused midstream, milk halfway to his lips. Palmer stared at the man as if he might be someone they'd seen on a television show. Fascination and a child's immediate trust, before fear had a chance to teach him other rules. Adriana moved toward the counter and ordered black coffee. He didn't sit in the center of the room, but chose a booth at a respectful distance. The silence grew thicker. Patrons angled their faces away, but their ears were still. He fished out a card from his wallet and set it on the table as if it were a small, deliberate offering. The card was plain, embossed, Adriano Silva. No titles, no explanation. Only a phone number, and curiously for such a man a scratch of an old address in the corner, like a memory he carried with him. He watched Juliana now. It was not aggression. It was the kind of attention that rewires breathing. She felt the weight of his gaze and tried to fold herself inward, to become only the warm shelter for the children and nothing more. A part of Hera's small, practical, part calculated exit routes. The distance to the bathroom, the number of napkins between plates, the probability of the collectors showing their faces. The rest of her simply dwelled in the present of their food and the soft rise and fall of childhood sleep. Adriano finished his coffee. He left the money on the table and exactness to the amount that mattered. 3 crisp bills, folded, not fanned. He walked toward Juliana's booth with the economy of someone not in need of permission. When he leaned in, the color of his voice surprised her. There was no demand, no swagger. "You look tired," he said. "Is this your family?" She blinked. The children shuffled closer like small magnets. Juliana's tongue felt heavy. Her mind worked in 2- and 3-step equations. "Yes," she said. There she stopped and looked at the man. It was mechanical how his name finished in her mind, Adriano Silva, as though the city itself had supplied the tag. She did not know him. She had seen his name on rumorous arrivals, quiet reconciliations, a man who kept his neighborhood intact in ways that never made the newspaper. People said he paid for funerals sometimes. People also said he rearranged debts for people nobody else would help. He nodded to the twins, his face soft in a way that made Juliana's chest twist. Not pity. Something else. He opened the portfolio and slid a stack of bills toward her as if setting a heavier thing down on the table. Her fingers hovered, not trusting the act. For a minute, she did not move. "You shouldn't accept charity," Adriano said. The words arrived almost as a lesson. "But you shouldn't go without." She managed to press her hands together, clasping them into a defense. "I have $15, she said. The confession came out small. "That's all." He looked at the napkin where her money lay, and for a breath he examined her hands. Work hardened, nails a little ragged, a small, pale burn on one finger from a stove accident in a motel a month ago. He placed the bills he had set out back into his folder. "Keep the 15, he said. He made a small motion with his fingers, and Ella appeared with a refill, eyes asking questions she could not voice. That moment, him telling her to keep the 15 landed like an impossible kindness, and Juliana felt a near violent urge to protect it, to run, to take those bills and disappear into the snow. Instead, she did something quieter. She whispered his name, the way one says a prayer. "Why are you?" His hand lay on the edge of the table. Then, an ordinary human gesture that did something extraordinary. It shortened the distance between fear and explanation. "I want to know your name," he replied. And I want to know who is bothering you. It felt like an interrogation dressed in good manners. Juliana tightened her hold on the twins' knees. They started, and then the world folded into 1,000 small, precise memories. The caller ID flashing Gregor Petro, the voice that didn't need to raise itself to issue punishment, Tommy Rudo delivering a paper envelope with an unpleasant amount of sugar in his smile. She was not brave. She had never been brave in the heroic sense. She was a woman trained by necessity to tell the truth, because lies cost more than fear. Gregor Petro, she said, then swallowed. Names carried a power that fluttered like moths under glass. She met Adriano's eyes and, as if under some invisible compulsion, added the other, Tommy Rudo. The room tightened. Adriano's jaw moved. For a second, his face became a map of calculation. He didn't react with anger that would have been easy and spectacular. He reacted with a colder thing, a planning mind. He put 2 fingers to his temple, almost as if taking inventory of what was owed, what could be repaired, what could not. He slid something across the table to her. An envelope heavy with something that was not mere cash. It felt like a small plan. There's a motel down the road, he said. Room is paid for a week. If you want, there's someone who can pick you up and take you there now. No questions tonight. No visitors, unless you tell me. Comfort rose and then curdled in Juliana's throat. It was relief, wrapped in an unease so old it had forgotten its own name. She glanced at her children, at the way Chloe had her chin in her hand, trying like all children to be brave with full trust. Why would you? Because, Adriano said slowly, and the word did not attempt to be moral. My mother died when I was small. She had no one. There were other men in my neighborhood who thought kindness was for children of better people. I promised my mother I wouldn't let that happen again to anyone if I could help it. His confession landed like an old coin worn, used, genuine perhaps, but stamped with a murky history. The tenderness in his statement was real. So was the threat implied in his history. Juliana read the 2 together and felt a sudden compliance in her muscles. She took the envelope, feeling the weight of small things inside. A card with a room number written in block letters. A small folded sheet of paper with a name and a number. A photograph of the motel's bland neon sign. There was a second envelope tucked within a thicker manila one. That felt official. She flexed it under her fingers and felt the solidity of paper. The weight of signatures, perhaps, or of a check. He did not smile when he pushed the envelope towards her. He seemed to know that a smile would make it charity, and charity was not what he wanted this to be. You don't have to tell me everything, he said. Just tell me who did this. She told him, in the way a mouth gives up a small, sharp thing. Slowly, breath held. She told him about the figures that had come to the door, about the polite calls, about the envelope shoved through her motel room crack with a number and a deadline. She told him about the sleepless nights and the heavy, metallic feeling in her chest. He listened like someone piecing together an engine he meant to fix. For a moment, Juliana wondered about consequence. Men like Adriano solved problems with an economy of decision that didn't worry about legalities. People said things about men like him, about reparation delivered at the end of a gun, about debt collected the way some people collect art. The story of the city had a gutter that ran under the law. Adriano walked that gutter with a lantern. He asked for details, addresses, the names of the men who'd called. Juliana supplied them. In the telling, she felt a strange, guilty relief. To name them was to hand them to someone bigger, someone who might do more than leave a note on her voicemail. But she also felt something else. The small, bitter knowledge that the debt owed to her and to David wouldn't be repaid with one envelope. Still, there was immediate math to address. Motel, food, a week's breathing room, practical things, not heroic ones. When Adriano stood, he did not leave. He tapped the number on his card as if deciding to test whether this was the right kind of trouble. He handed his business card across with an insistence that felt like ownership of the promise. Call me if anything happens, he said. If anyone comes near you, you call me first. He said it simply, as if he were giving instructions. Juliana felt the world narrow around that card in her fingers. It was a thing she could use like a key. She thought of the tiny sliver of trust it contained, and how she could not afford even a sliver of mistake. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was small, worn. Ella, the waitress, watched with a private and knowing sorrow. She wiped the counter with a slow movement, as if tidying up after a storm. There was a small, dangerous impulse in the room, people wanting to know more, to see what would happen next. Phones peeked out of pockets, and the room became a nest of silent witnesses. Adriano did not force the spectacle. He left as quietly as he had arrived, snow crunching underfoot. The door closed and, like a released breath, some of the tension in the diner eased. Yet the air was altered. Juliana felt it in the way the coffee tasted metallic for a moment. She folded the card into her wallet, and for the first time in months, let herself imagine the twins in a bed that didn't squeak, in a room with curtains that shut properly against the winter. The envelope on the table felt like a promise, not a miracle. There would be terms. There would likely be a cost. "Are you okay?" Ella asked, voice soft. Juliana forced a small smile. "We're okay for now," she said. Thank you so much." She wrapped her coat around the children and they left the diner together, the bell over the door chiming their exit into the night. Snow glinted under the streetlights like a promise or a threat. Juliana could not decide which. The motel was a 15-minute ride. The driver, an older man with a warm, gentle face, kept silent, like he had been given instructions not to pry. He took the envelope with one hand, as if it were a valuable item he had been told to guard. When he dropped them off at the motel, the clerk checked them in without a question, generating a key and a staccato latch that felt like bureaucracy's minimal mercy. The room smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. It was small, with a single lamp and a television that mouthed the news in a corner. Chloe collapsed onto one bed and curled around Palmer, who promptly closed his eyes and resumed his puppet-like breathing. Juliana sat on the edge of the other bed and opened the manila envelope that had been taped shut. Her hands trembled in a way she couldn't hide. Inside was a thick packet of documents, typeset and precise, and a folded cashier's check for an amount she couldn't make sense of at first. There was a cover letter from a law office with a heading she didn't recognize and a name signed with a neat, decisive hand that said Adriano Silva. The letter was careful with its language. It spoke of a settlement agreement and of immediate payment in consideration of full release of all outstanding claims. It stated, in formal terms, that Adriano Silva, through his representative, agreed to settle outstanding debts held by certain collections on behalf of Juliana Molina, representing the full and final satisfaction of the amounts itemized in the attached schedule. Even as Juliana read, she knew not to take legalese at face value. She thumbed through the attached pages, itemized accounts, account numbers, balances, the names of collection agencies, phone numbers, paper that spoke in the currency of bureaucracy. There were stamps, a notary's seal, an official-looking signature. The cashier's check was substantial and immediate. It was money she could use tomorrow. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of the lamp and let herself imagine numbers shifting into zeros and dimes, fantasy that was nearly obscene in its sudden comfort. But even as relief soaked through her, an old wiring in her mind flickered a warning. This had not been free. Men like Adriano did not hand out such bundles without expecting something in return. She had seen the way debt could be transferred and how favors could be owed in ways that were not counted on paper. She set the packet beside the phone and looked at her sleeping children. Their breathing was a child's music. It steadied her. Juliana thought of the envelope as a tool she could use in small increments. Motel for a week. Groceries. School registration fee paid. She thought of it as a bandage. The bigger problem, the men who made a business of peeling down people's dignity for payment, still existed. Yet for the first night in months, she allowed herself that small, dangerous thing. Gratitude without bargaining for protection. A knock on the door startled her. She sat up, pulse jerking. Through the peephole, a face she did not recognize smiled a dull smile and held up a keyed card with a hotel logo. He was not an imposing man. He looked like someone who had delivered a message. He placed a plain brown envelope under the door and left without knocking again. Juliana opened it with her thumbs and found a small slip of paper with a street address and a name Rico. Under it, a phone number. There was also a photograph, a building, and beneath it, a single line in a hand that was unusually neat. "We will take care of it. Trust me." She looked at that photograph, and then at the sleeping twins, and felt the world tilt. The motel provided safety of a sort. 4 walls, a lock, but the city's shadow resided outside in men with paper and names, and the slow, insistent mechanisms of punishment. Adriano's paper promised to interrupt those mechanisms. It promised an intervention that looked like protection and felt like power. It promised a clean ledger. Night advanced. She placed the packet and the cards on the bedside table, stacking them like objects that could hold shame at bay. Outside, something moved across the parking lot. She lay down beside the children and watched the ceiling light bloom into cheap stars. For a while she let herself sleep in bits, waking to the small, steady breathing of the twins, counting their chests rise and fall, counting to something like grace. Down the street, in a place with concrete walls and the smell of oil and bleach, Adriano inhaled and exhaled, and then worked through a list in his ledger mind. He called Rico once and laid out names and times. His voice was flat, the way someone who has made difficult decisions must be, precise, and without a tremor that others could read. He did not promise to be gentle. He promised only to make the problem stop. He believed, with the rigid conviction of someone who had built his life on hidden rationales, that he was correcting a small injustice with the blunt instruments he had at hand. There was a line in his chest that tightened as he thought about his mother and the men who had taken from her. He had learned to answer theft with rules of his own. Not indiscriminate violence, but calibrated retribution meant to restore balance that a court could not attain for people like Juliana. He also carried a ledger of his own that did not involve numbers. He had been a child who had watched kindness vanish under the weight of other men's decisions. That memory lived in him like a constant companion, and it was part nurturing impulse, part obsession. He had given money for funeral arrangements. He had paid for medicine. He had a roster of men whose debts he'd absorbed and then recalibrated. People in his orbit called him protector or boss, sometimes both, sometimes neither. When morning came, Juliana woke with the thin film of motel dust on her cheek. Chloe and Palmer were already awake, playing quietly with the paper cups they'd made into little hats. Juliana dressed them and went to the front desk. The clerk, silent efficient, gave her a packet of extras, breakfast vouchers, a quick map of nearby services. On the breakfast tray was a small note in handwriting she did not know. "If you need more time, call the number." Essie. She felt the card in her wallet like a talisman. The cashier's check sat in the packet beside the signed documents. There were practical steps to take, appointments to keep, phone numbers to call. Juliana had an instinctive mistrust of quick fixes, but she was also a mother who had learned when to accept help. She had a list now. Food, a child's jacket replaced, a week of rent in a box she could not see clearly. The manila envelope had meaning beyond cash. It had paper that opened doors in that world of middlemen and legalese. It had signatures meant to be legal currency. That afternoon Adriano called. His voice was less formal now. He asked a few more questions and told her that men named Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo had a meeting scheduled for the day, and that it would be in their best interest to stop making calls. Juliana listened, feeling the spirit in her chest, an odd mix of gratitude and discomfort. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. The phrase tasted feeble. "No thanks," he said. His voice carried a private edge. "Just be careful. If they come, do not answer the door. Call the number on the card. We'll handle it." The rest of the afternoon passed with the small tasks of survival. A visit to a welfare office where forms multiplied like paper birds. A short line at a thrift shop for a children's coat. Chloe's delighted squeal when Juliana bought a small box of crayons. The world reclothed itself in easy motions, feeding, dressing, counting. Every now and then, Juliana placed the manila envelope against her palm as if feeling for the heat of someone's promise. It warmed in her hand like a small coal. Word traveled along soft channels. The parking lot of the motel had become a place where men watched and recorded, A beat-up sedan idled for a time across the street and then moved on. Juliana watched through the thin curtains and felt the old animal instinct: watch, sequester, measuring gauge. She wanted to call Adriano and tell him everything that moved in and out of her vision. But she held back, cautious. She packed the children's small bags and kept receipts in a folder. Even as she tried to plan, there was the stubborn reality that this was not a long-term solution. A week at a motel bought a week's breathing, not a new life. Yet, inside the manila envelope, scribbled instructions and legalese suggested a route forward, items to file, numbers to call, a name of a lawyer she could meet, and maybe, eventually, a path to real stability. The cashier's check would clear in days. That would pay some things off. But there would always be other obligations. Other men who measured everything in bite-sized sums. Late in the day, Rico arrived, a neat, low-profile man with quick eyes. He knocked politely at the door and introduced himself like a neighbor. He was pleasant, in a way that didn't try to erase intent. He sat with Juliana at the small motel table and asked a few brief questions about dates and names in a tone that suggested paper rather than gut. It was a dislocating intimacy. How quick the world could shift from threat to a different kind of threat, one that promised safety but made demands that did not show up in the language of courts. Rico left with a handshake and a businesslike, curt nod. He told her there was someone she should meet in a few days, a lawyer who would help organize the papers and ensure the settlement would be recognized by the right places. He did not say how Adriano planned to reach Gregor and Tommy. The implication was enough. Juliana, who had been fed a steady diet of distrust, felt something like nausea and something like relief swirl inside her. That night, as she tucked the twins in, Juliana thumbed the card with Adriana's number and felt the small, hard truth settle. She had traded one kind of unknown for another. She tried to imagine the future as a simple series of acts. Sign here, pay there, move into a small apartment, get a job at the florist, be quiet. But she also knew that quiet could be a tentacle. Protection could become control if left unchecked. She had seen that in the way people sometimes thanked men like Adoriano. Do, with the gratitude of the debtors and the suspicion of those who could view such manipulations as kindness or as dominance. For now, though, she slept in a motel room that had a proper lock. Chloe and Palmer breathed in the small, untroubled way of children who do not yet care to weigh the world. Far away, a set of men in a warehouse measured time with a different clock. They moved with a businesslike efficiency. There were no raised voices, no cinematic threats. The tools of fear were small and precise. A ledger with numbers, a calendar, the knowledge of where men like Gregor and Tommy tended to set their meetings. A van rolled out at dusk. Names were said quietly over the radio. It was methodical, designed to unsettle rather than to maim. Juliana woke the next morning to the sun making a silver line across the motel curtain as if it had drawn something to be revealed. Her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the line belonged to someone who had been described as a lawyer, efficient and almost comforting in the way that bureaucracy can be. "Ms. Molina?" the voice asked. "Mr. Silva has retained me to ensure your accounts are brought into settlement. There will be some paperwork we need you to sign. There is no rush. We will provide a secure place to meet you." She felt the envelope in her bag like a small promise. She slid her thumb across the cardboard edge and, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, looked up at the ceiling and smiled in the private way of someone who had not smiled in a long time. The smile did not erase the rest of her life. It did not fix the ache of David's absence or the calendar that still had bills penciled into it, but it made the day lighter in small, crucial knots. When she hung up, the number on the card looked less like a talisman and more like a set of instructions. Call, check, sign. She packed the twins into their coats and strapped them into their car seats. On the front seat, the manila envelope sat like an artifact from a world she had not inhabited but was now being invited into. The motel clerk called a cab to take them to a social services office. The lawyer had suggested arranging childcare for the meeting, but Juliana wanted the twins with her. She wanted to learn how to say no to the world in front of them. As they left, she caught a glimpse through the motel glass of the sedan leaving the lot. It pulled away slowly, then accelerated, slipping into the traffic, like a quiet line being erased. Juliana felt her hand on the envelope again, fingers pressing the cardboard as if to reassure herself that it would not vanish. She did not want to be indebted to anyone, but she was also, in an odd and private way, grateful for the first time in a long time. The social services office smelled of coffee and printed forms. A woman at the front desk handed them a clipboard and a number. The lawyer's office was 2 blocks away, an unremarkable storefront with blinds that kept things tidy. When they entered, Juliana felt the tiny theater of privilege. Paintings on the wall, a thin rug, a receptionist who introduced himself like a well-rehearsed host. A man in a suit, neat but not overtly imposing, rose to meet her and led her to a small conference room. His manner was professional, almost too calm, the way someone handling paper prefers things to be. He explained the documents with a clear, dry voice. There were signatures to make, dates to confirm, a small official check to be endorsed. He suggested that they be discreet for safety's sake and offered to coordinate with the motel if needed. There was a comfort to the legal language, and the stamps, and the officiality. It made the act of being rescued feel like a civil transaction, like moving obligations from one ledger to another. Juliana signed where asked, initialed the pages, and received in return the copy of a settlement agreement that bore the notary's mark and a payment schedule that would wipe certain accounts clear. She pinched the edge of the paper and let herself feel the watril, practical, not miraculous. On the walk back, Chloe chattered about crayons, and Palmer pointed at a dog that trotted by with a proud, prancing gait. The ordinary movements of a child's world, stitched together, the present like careful embroidery. Juliana thought of the man who had sat in the diner and the envelope in her purse, and she felt the strange, double-edged emotion that had become familiar. Relief, threaded with unease. As the afternoon wore toward evening, she walked the twins past a florist's shop with frost on the window. Mrs. Gable, the florist, was a woman with bright hair and a manner like warm wool. She was pruning roses behind the glass, her hands steady and kind. The shop smelled of green stems and the waxy sweetness of lilies. Juliana had seen this woman before, standing under a market awning, handing out small posies to people who lingered. The card from Adriano had mentioned Mrs. Gable. It mentioned a job. Could you use help? Juliana asked almost shyly. Mrs. Gable looked up and then smiled at the children. Always, she said. Come in and tell me what you can do. Juliana thought of petty indignities and new work and the modest dignity of earning. She thought of people who sat through ugly things and then learned how to count, in small ways, the days that pieced a life back together. She imagined working under the fluorescent bulbs, arranging stems with a patient hand, and teaching the twins to fold tissue paper neatly. It was not a grand destiny. It was ordinary and beautiful. That night, the envelope on the bedside table was still there. Only now, it had neighbors. A small apartment listing typed, neat some coupons, the stamped photocopy of the settlement. Juliana laid the children down and read the documents until her eyes blurred, until their edges flattened into a new geography. She did not know whether this was the beginning of restoration or a stop on a longer, less certain journey. What she did know with absolute clarity was that tonight the twins would sleep without waking at the sound of a knock on the door. Outside, at dusk, a van with no license plate parked some distance from the motel. 2 men stepped out and stood like sentinels, silent and precise. They spoke in measured tones, planning, not with the loud gestures of men seeking spectacle, but with the soft competence of people who work in the quiet back rooms of the city. They had addresses, alibis, and a method. The plan did not involve showmanship, but consequence. They would not make headlines. They would rearrange the immediate problem. Juliana, in the thin light of the motel lamp, fell asleep with a child's drawing of a sun tucked into the copies of her documents, the yellow marker thick and triumphant. The card with Adriano's number lay like a promise in her wallet. She did not know how to balance the gratitude she felt for the man who had offered the envelope with the unease that wrapped around his methods. That tension would sit with her for days to come. For now, it was only an ache beneath the skin. Later that night, in a warehouse where the fluorescent lights hummed, men stood and exchanged notes. There was no brutality. There were deals and a rehearsal of speech, Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo were called. Plans were made. An unseen curtain would fall on the men who had been pestering Juliana. The mechanisms of this city could be stopped by paper, by money, or by a rearrangement of consequences. In Adriano's ledger, if the warehouse had a heartbeat, it would have been a slow, deliberate tapping, men moving by rhythm, footsteps measured against the concrete, the soft rustle of paper, as names were checked twice. There was no show of violence. There didn't need to be. Adriano Silva understood the arithmetic of fear. You could make a man stop by breaking things that mattered to him, or you could make him sign away the things he thought would save him. Both produced the same quiet compliance. Rico brought in the men personally. He wore the look of someone who trafficked not in spectacle but in inevitability. A small file, a clean suit, a manner that made a man think twice about making a sound. Gregor Petro and Tommy Rudo were not dragged in through a door, with knives flashing. They arrived in a sedan, their faces folded into an expression that said they expected trouble but didn't know its currency. They were territorial men in well-pressed coats who believed that menace lived in tone and timing, not in paperwork. When they realized the meeting room was a fluorescently lit cell with a single table and 2 chairs, whatever swagger they'd practiced at the fringes of city life thinned. Adriano did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He sat across from them like a magistrate with a ledger more precise than any bench court. His presence was a pressure, a suffocating patience. On the table between them, folded into layers of manila and stamped paper, was a packet that changed the shape of culpability. A release agreement, a signed confession of harassment, an accounting of amounts, and a single line that mattered more than any threat. Full and final release of all claims against Juliana Molina. The signature space was conspicuously empty. Rico slid the file forward. "Sign here," he said. The tone was flat, almost courteous. It didn't sound like an offer. It sounded like a condition. Gregor looked at Tommy, an attempt to find solidarity in a man who was supposed to mirror you in courage. Instead, he found his own breath catching. He read the line stumps in no language heroics calculations of restitution, amounts to be paid, an order that the collectors would cease contact and that any future claims would be redirected to a single escrow. There were also consequences listed in thin print, things about failure to comply that didn't mention teeth or bone but the kinds of losses a man taught to guard his pride would feel. Thomas Rudo had never liked signatures. He trusted muscle and presence, not paper that could be turned and turned until it breathed like a deadline. Now there was a pen in front of him. Rico produced 2. One was a fountain pen of ordinary metal, the other was a cheaper ballpoint. Gregor hesitated, then took the fountain pen, as if it were a bribe, and his handwriting hurried over the lines with the small, ugly shame of a man who realizes he's been outmatched in a way that leaves no dramatic options. No one in that room raised a gun. No one needed to. The men understood the shape of Adriano's reach: economic strangulation, loss of territory, exposure to authorities who might decide to notice small indiscretions if certain ledgers were opened. It was a kind of enforced civility. They signed. When the signatures were on the paper, Rico produced a second envelope. It was heavy, with the feel of currency. Adriano slid it across the table to Gregor. "This is to settle accounts," Adriano said. "It allows you to walk away without losing more than you already have." Gregor opened it like a man accepting a wound. There were checks, numbers, and a receipt, legal things that would allow him to hold his head up in public while his business bled in private. That was the calculus. It was not mercy. It was a rerouting of consequence. Later, when Juliana would read the papers, she would find the familiar bureaucratic marks, the return addresses, the stamps. The names of agencies she had long suspected were functioning on the edge of ethical practice. There would be a line, in a hand she could now recognize, that said this: "All contact with Ms. Molina is terminated and payment in the amount of itemized has been remitted to the undersigned," and there would be an affidavit of legal language intended to be enforceable enough to stop a man who relied on letters and voicemail. Back at the motel, Juliana did not know who had signed what. She had been given a packet and told, as if it were a small kindness, to open it when she felt the twins were settled. She had put them to sleep with the slow patience of mothers who have practiced lullabies until they are themselves rhythmic compasses. The envelope with the lawyer's stamp had sat thick and improbable on the nightstand, like a talisman. Now, in the cold light of the next morning, Juliana slit the flap and read. The release agreements were neat, dated, stamped. There were copies of the signed confessions. There was a document with a cashier's check for a sum labeled settlement and moving allowance. And there was a short, typed note from Adriano Silva, his name printed like a signature, not begging and not heroic. We have made the problem stop. Use this to move. Be careful. Ah, Essie. She sat on the edge of the bed with the papers on her knees and let the room tilt. The twins had woken and were batting pancakes into mouths with the clumsy joy of children who had not been awake to listen to men argue. Their laughter in the bathroom as they splashed milk on the floor sounded like permission. Juliana ran her finger along the signature line in the release agreement as if she could feel the scratch there like a seam she could later undo. There were no guarantees beyond the thin things paper could secure, but the immediate threats that had atomized sleep into staccato bursts, phone calls at odd hours. Envelopes shoved beneath doors had an end date stamped next to them now. The lawyer arranged for a taxi to take them to a small apartment a few neighborhoods over. It was not luxurious. It had a mailbox that didn't show its rust, a door that closed, and windows that would let in light. The landlord wasn't the kind to ask too many questions about who paid the first month's rent. The keys were small brass proof cold to hold, familiar as a pledge. Juliana brushed the teeth of the keys as if they were a new sort of benediction. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner, and the faintness of a life just beginning to be arranged. There was a threadbare rug in the living room and a small stove with the circular scars of previous meals. The twins' beds were narrow and already made with plain sheets. Juliana placed the manila envelope on the kitchen table and set the cashier's check on top like an altar. She slid the apartment key into her palm and, in the same gesture, felt something in her chest unclench. Mrs. Gable's florist was where the slow mending began in practical terms. It was not a charity. It was a place that needed hands and had a corner where children's laughter could mix with the scent of green stems. Juliana learned quickly that flowers taught you patience and order. Roses required trimming and a soft, unhurried hand. Bouquets demanded attention to shape and texture. She learned to cut stems at an angle and wrap tissue paper so the edges looked like the soft frond of a promise. At first, her work was fragmentada. Few hours here, a string of part-time shifts there. She arrived early and stayed late on mornings when there were whole funeral orders to prepare. Mrs. Gable watched. Juliana shaped stems the way someone watches a child who is learning to count. The job did more than provide an income. It provided a calendar, shifts to plan around, bills penciled into their margins. The ordinary architecture of days that had been missing in the months after David's death. The twins learned the routine too. Palmer would pack a little notebook with scribbles and a napkin with a crayon. Chloe would help hand out small posies to people who walked past the window, holding the flowers as if they were small, loaned treasures. The security panel, Adriano, had insisted on an item of quiet, technical benevolence went on the wall near the front door. The woman from the company installed it with apologies about the wiring and an efficiency born of other people's emergencies. Juliana watched the small green light blink alive as if it were a beacon. It felt ridiculous and sacred at once. A tiny digital scanner that could keep out the men who rang and refused to leave. She learned the routine, the code to arm it at night, the little button under the counter that would send an alert to a number she trusted. The green light glowed like a hopeful eye and, for the first time in months, she slept with both doors locked and the knowledge that someone dangerous perhaps, but decisive had erected a thin fence around their little life. Adriano's interventions were not gift without demand. He had ways of measuring installation. He believed in rules, his rules about when one used force and when one used paper. When he wanted a man corrected, he used the appropriate instruments of correction. Often it was money moved in a way that didn't destine the man to starve. Other times it was humiliation measured enough to keep the man's level of threat beneath a threshold. He believed in a code, no killing of innocent bystanders, no unnecessary cruelty, consequences targeted at those who had chosen predatory work. It was a moral system with ugly teeth. Juliana learned several principles in the first weeks after the move. One was practical: never trust the silence on the phone. Another was social: strangers with soft eyes sometimes delivered harder things than bolts and barbed wire. The last was personal: some debts are paid with cash and signatures. Others are paid in the quiet surrender of pride. She did not know whether she would be obligated to Adriano for the rest of her life in ways that would make her feel small or grateful. For now, she focused on registering the twins for school and learning to balance a checkbook again without the stomach flutters she had grown used to. There were small humiliations to navigate. A social worker asked questions about how long they'd been in the area, about whether they'd experienced threats, about the mechanics of the settlement. Juliana answered with practiced economy. In the parking lot after one meeting, she noticed the sedan across the street again, waiting. She watched it go and felt the old instinct to shrink. Later, at home, she told Chloe and Palmer a story about how sometimes visitors bring gifts and sometimes they bring lessons. She left out the parts she thought might frighten them because she was learning slowly that a mother's job was not just to shield but to shape how they stored the world. One evening, as frost rimed the windows and the twins slept with the soft, even breathing of children who had not known the sound of a repo truck, Juliana opened her wallet and found Adriano's card. She turned it over in her fingers and found a single line scrawled on the back in a hand that matched the note in the manila envelope. If anything changes, call quietly. There was no hint of savior, only of an arrangement. She slid it back under the small pile of grocery receipts and let it be the small thing it was. A tool. She had agency now in a way she hadn't in months. She could refuse invitations. She could accept help on her terms. Adriano's protection had not been miraculous. It had been purchased in the manner he knew best: calculation, payment, enforcement. Weeks turned into months. The little apartment became a map of ordinary life. A cheap coffee maker left on the counter, a stack of library books by the bedside, school forms that needed signatures. The twins learned to march to the cadence of school bells. Chloe's chipped tooth was fixed with a kindly dentist who accepted a payment plan. Palmer's teacher recommended him for a reading program because he liked to tell stories. Juliana found a rhythm at the florist where she could make enough to pay the bills and the occasional luxury, like a new pair of shoes for the twins. She learned to cook a meal that didn't involve plastic plates, to hang curtains that would keep the winter wind out, to file away the receipts of a life that stubbornly wanted to continue. Even as life mended, the underside of Adriano's intervention lingered in the shape of occasional alarms going off at the florist. A polite man showing up to take a signature, or the sudden appearance of a check in the mail labeled for school costs. Adriano liked neatness. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted things orderly. He wanted the ledger balanced and those who preyed upon the vulnerable pushed out of their orbit. He also, privately, liked to see people survive. When Juliana met Adriano again, it wasn't in a diner or a supermarket, but at a crossroads of necessity. He arranged the meeting as if it were a business call. A short message to her number asking if she'd accept a coffee, and a mention of the florist as the place he'd be in town. She had learned that meetings with him were boxed and limited. There would be talk, and then he would withdraw into whatever orbit he inhabited. She accepted because there was a part of her that wanted to speak plainly. She wanted to know what she owed beyond paper. He arrived in a car that hummed like a contained animal. He was not ceremonious. He sat at a table near the window and watched the street. When he looked up, his eyes met hers without the layered small talk of men who needed to see the truth. "Are you doing all right?" he asked. Not because he required an answer, but because habit had taught him to check. Juliana folded her fingers around her mug, listening to the heat of the ceramic. "We're getting there," she said. "The kids are in school. Mrs. Gable's been very kind." He nodded. There was a pause in which both of them assessed what the other might say without malice or sentimentality. She wanted to ask him why he had intervened with such a scale. She wanted to ask if protection like that came with permanent strings. Instead, she asked the question more honestly. "Why did you help us?" She said, "I don't understand the line between being dangerous and being kind." Adriano's face softened in a way that made no pretense of absolution. "My mother," he said simply. He spoke of the woman he had once watched be dismissed for nothing. He spoke of a small boy who had promised he would make things right in a way his mother couldn't. He said these things not as an apology but as an explanation. "There are many ways to do harm," he added. "There are many ways to stop it. I choose what I can do." He did not frame himself as hero. He did not ask for thanks. He outlined his code the way someone states a contract. He would not command people to do his dirty work in his name. He measured his actions within his idea of justice, targeted, efficient, and with a clear threshold for collateral damage. Juliana listened and felt something like understanding for the first time. She also felt unease. Kindness performed by someone who used violence as a tool is still kindness given on terms. She was free now in many ways, but part of that freedom had a cost outlined only in the narrow print of a man's rulebook. She would live with that. The weekly checks arrived for several months, small amounts for school and clothes, delivered anonymously with an appropriate distance that preserved Juliana's pride. There were occasional phone calls routed through Rico, short and practical. Once, when a debt collector tried to contact an old landlord, the call dropped into a line of men in suits who made the same documentation Adriano had insisted on appear on the collector's desk. They were not friendly about it, but they enforced the release. Time! The careful mender stitched routines into daily life. The twins learned to read and to argue over who made the best paper airplane. Chloe started piano lessons with a local church youth program. Palmer learned to keep a bug journal and could memorize long stretches of weather forecasts. Juliana learned to sleep without the flinch at every knock and to answer the phone without momentary paralysis. She moved beyond the motel vocabulary of survival into the lexicon of living. There were losses she would carry always. David's absence remained an interior geography she navigated with small compass points. His tools rusting in a corner of a shed, the faded photo in a wallet she rarely opened, the holidays that had to be made anew. There were scars on her heart that would not be healed by checks or signatures. The settlement had cleared the ledger of certain debts. It could not replace a life. Still, the children grew warmer, and the rent was paid on time. In money and in the rhythm of days, the world came back to a tolerable hue. 5 years later, the apartment was no longer a staging ground, but a home. The security panel's green light hummed like an old friend. Chloe, now a little taller and braver about her crooked front tooth, practiced cooking lessons at the stove with the same concentration she had once reserved for drawing suns. Palmer was 7 now, with knees and elbows that read like topography little maps of his childhood. They moved through the home as if it had always belonged to them. The florist shop had confirmed Juliana as an indispensable hand. Mrs. Gable had stopped saying, "If you can spare the time," and instead scheduled Juliana for the morning shift. On a Tuesday that smelled of rain and warm bread, Juliana walked them to school and then crossed the street toward a small cafe. She had been invited on understated note slipped into the florist's drawer to meet someone who wanted to speak of a community program she might help coordinate for other single parents. She liked the idea of being able to make small things easier for others. It was a way of returning something to a world that had helped her in the strangest ways. She was there early and sat with her hands clasped around a steaming cup, watching people move like the city breathed. Her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, and she nearly let it go to voicemail. Instead, she answered. The voice on the line was Rico's, softly clipped. "He's here," the man said. "He thought you might appreciate a book for the children's shelf. He left it at the cafe." No fanfare. Juliana let herself smile, a private curl of gratitude and resignation. She walked to the counter and found a thin book on urban wildlife animals that lived in small, hidden place is wrapped in plain paper with a short note. For curious hands, A.S. It was not a donation meant for applause. It was a small, precise offering that matched the nature of the man who had arranged their lives several years before. She slid the book under the twins' reading pile and felt the smallness of the gesture warm her for a moment. That same week, a bureaucratic letter arrived. A final closure confirmation from a collection agency she'd once feared. The language was clinical. The stamp was real. The letter ended with a line that felt like a period in a sentence that had been running for too long. Account closed and satisfied. Juliana kept the letter in a drawer next to the twins' birth certificates and David's old watch. She would, sometimes at night when sleep was slow, pull it out and smooth a crease as if proof could be domestic. Adriano's presence remained a shadow at the edge of life, rather than a center. He did not come to birthday parties or to school recitals. He did not sit at their table. He maintained distance the way someone who knew the difference between guardianship and ownership should. There were occasional signs he had not forgotten them. An annual donation to a college savings plan in the twins' names, a discreet call to clear up a landlord's error, a polite request to respect boundaries. In all of this, Juliana felt a layered sense of obligation and an odd freedom. She had been rescued from the hunger of the night by a man with rules. She now navigated the world with the memory of both kindness and the sharpness of the means that had delivered it. The moral complexity of it all didn't dissolve. Juliana had friends who whispered about the wrongness of the means. Some suggested legal action. Others argued that one shouldn't accept help that came with the risk of exchanging liberty for safety. She listened and nodded and kept the conversation too small. Considerato proboscis. She knew that people like Adriano didn't make themselves out to be saints. They made themselves out to be necessary. That didn't make them noble, but it made them effective inside an ecosystem that had failed many gentle people. On a quiet afternoon years later, Juliana stood at the counter of Mrs. Gable's shop and arranged a bouquet with practiced hands. Winter greenery interlaced with small white carnations. Chloe and Palmer were at home doing homework. Juliana finished the bouquet and slipped it into a paper wrapper, then turned to find a small envelope left on the counter by an employee who'd seen it was addressed to her. Inside was a photograph. Adriano older by a few years' stemples, still threaded with gray, standing in front of a community center he had helped to fund. A project no journalist had penned a headline about. On the back of the photograph, in a short, careful scrawl, were the words, "Things are better when people are quiet about them. Keep your life." A.S.C. Juliana folded the photograph and placed it into her wallet, next to David's watch. She felt, as she had from the beginning, gratitude knotted with unease. She could never erase the ambiguity that shadowed help offered by a man who walked the city's gutters with a lantern. She could, however, teach her children to count the cost of kindness and to know that safety often has a shape and a price. Years later still, when Chloe was older and entering high school, and Palmer had become the sort of child who loved physics kits and took apart toys to see what made them work, Juliana would think of the night she had held $15 and counted the possible futures like stones in a river. She would remember the diner, the grilled cheese, the smell of coffee, the way Ella had offered warmth with her hands. She would remember the hush when Adriano had entered, the business card placed with intent on a laminate table, the way he had looked at her hands. And she would remember the envelopes, the manila one, the cashier's check, the small pieces of paper that had redrawn the map of their life. Adriana's shadow never left them entirely. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, Juliana would feel the faint presence of regulation, a new job prospect sanctioned with a check in the mail, a call from an old landlord who had been persuaded to release their deposit, an anonymous scholarship whispering on a notice board at school. She never met him in the small ways she might have expected a guardian to show up. No grand, cinematic rescues. Instead, there were small measured acts, transactions, signatures, mute deliveries that, stitched into the fabric of their days. Once, when the twins were older and life had settled into a rhythm, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a note, a few sentences. "We do not want to be part of your later troubles. Keep the life you've made. Keep them safe. If you ever need us, call." A.S.C. She placed the letter in a drawer with the photograph and the release agreements, and then closed it. The drawer was a repository of bargains, the cost of safety, the records of the trade. Sometimes she allowed herself to feel angry about the unevenness of it all. Sometimes she felt grateful. She lived with both and offered that complex legacy to her children in the simplest way she knew, by teaching them how to be useful, to plant seeds in an ordinary window box, to pay respect to those who showed up in quiet ways. On a December afternoon, 5 years after that first diner encounter, Juliana watched Chloe and Palmer walk home from school, their backpacks bulging with homework and small triumphs. The street smelled of wet leaves, and the city made its habitual clatter. She stood at the window of her apartment and saw them arguing about whether to stop for hot chocolate. The sight made her chest tighten with a gratitude that was not blithe, but deep, layered with all the things that had come before. A car eased into a space 2 blocks away. It was Adriano's pattern to be seen from a distance, present but not imposing. He sat in the car for a moment and watched the neighborhood like a man making sure his account books were balanced in ways that mattered only to him. He wasn't there to intrude. He was there to check, to ensure a promise he had made had not been broken. Then he drove away, as he always did, a private exit without fanfare. Juliana stood and went to the small shelf where she'd placed the book Adriano had left years ago. She ran her fingers along its spine and then turned to the twins, who had now burst into the apartment in a flurry of laughter and crayons. She hugged them both, counting the ribs of their small backs like one counts the days into safety. "Who wants hot chocolate?" she asked, as if it were the most ordinary offer in the world. They cheered. She made 2 mugs and sat them on the table, watching them sip, watching the thin curls rise from their cups. Outside, somewhere in the city's indifferent web, there were men who still measured and remeasured accounts, who still decided when and how to exert pressure. Inside, there was a woman who had been tempered by loss and who had learned how to keep her children warm with the simple currency of bread and new shoes. The last image Juliana would keep of Adriano was not violent or grand, but domestic and unsettling, the small business card, the hand that had once pushed 3 bills across a diner's laminate surface, the envelope that had tightly rethreaded their life, enough to let her breathe. The most shocking part of that first night, the reversal, promised in the title that had hooked strangers' curiosity, was not that a mafia boss walked into a diner and paid a bill. It was that a man with the capacity to destroy used his power to rebuild, albeit on his own terms, and that the consequences of that kindness would ripple for years. The shock was ethical, not theatrical. The idea that safety could be purchased, that protection could be both gift and claim, and that moral clarity rarely came without a price. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling where you're watching from and what part surprised you most. And check the next video for another true style, tense drama.